Hello, I'm Heidi Seligman, one of the staff therapists with the Lawyers Assistance Program of the Washington State Bar Association, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Work Plus Wellness series presentation, Job Seeker Skills for Attorneys. I'm proud to introduce Karen Somerville, founder of Legal Career Management, who will be giving our Work Plus Wellness series presentation for today. Karen was a practicing commercial litigation lawyer for 12 years before shifting to the legal career counseling field. Now, after more than 15 years of assisting lawyers in finding career satisfaction, she has helped thousands. We are delighted to welcome Karen back to the Lawyers Assistance Program to share her proven expertise and guidance on the topic of the job search and finding career success. Thank you for being here, Karen.
Thank you, Heidi. I'm Karen Somerville, and this actually is an important month for me. It was 20 years ago this month that I started doing what I'm doing now and started legal career management and started helping attorneys find success and satisfaction in their legal careers, or their careers, I should say. Some of my clients don't end up practicing law. And basically the way I look at it is I help my lawyer clients figure out what it is that they want to do and where to find it. As Heidi said, I have helped a lot of lawyers over the years, including seminars and everything, in the thousands, and individual clients, somewhere between 12 and 1,500 over these last 20 years. I did begin my legal career, though, in a very traditional fashion. I practiced with a firm, I became a partner, and then I had a baby, and life stopped kind of making sense. I was putting in some 16-hour days. I would have a babysitter relieve the nanny. I would come home and my son was in bed. And so at that point, I chose to work with a career counselor. And it was in working with her that I thought, I really want to do what she does. This looks so much more enjoyable than practicing law. And to say that everything else followed would be a little bit misleading. It was not easy from that kind of moment of, oh, I'd love to do what she does, to where I was even 20 years ago. There were a lot of ups and downs, a lot of trials, a lot of kind of trying one thing and that didn't quite work. So it's not, when you hear people talk about career success, don't imagine that it's all been a trajectory that looks like this. It's not. None of us has that kind of a career. It's more of a kind of a trying, and eventually, if we are thoughtful about it and we ask the right questions of ourselves, I think we can build a career that does not only make sense, but gives us incredible satisfaction. One of the things that I have learned in these 20 years, and I didn't appreciate when I was practicing law, is the difference between skills and talents. As lawyers, we come into law school with a certain body of talents. We all are unique. And when we go to law school, what happens is we add skills. We learn critical and analytical research and writing skills. We learn oral advocacy. We learn to think like a lawyer. But what often happens in that process is we forget who we are in our unique talents. And I look at talents as being those things that we are born with. And that helps you kind of find what you were born to do. And hopefully, in the process of becoming a lawyer, you didn't lose those talents, and you probably didn't, but we want to find some place where we can bring those together. And those are the happiest former clients that I have, is where they've been able to mesh and kind of dovetail their talents and their skills. Another way that I express that is to help my clients find that place where their deep gladness meets the world's deep need. And that really brings it down to, what is it that I want to do? What is it that I'm born to do? What makes me happy when I'm doing it? And where does the world need this? And that addresses both the internal issue of what should I be doing with my life, and the external piece, which is the economy, and what will I be paid to do? And there are a lot of creative ways of being paid to do the things that we're born to do, but we have to think outside of the traditional, I just need to find a job in a law firm. If we think that way, we eliminate probably 99% of all of the possibilities out there. In presenting today, what I want to do is go through a checklist that I created, and I probably created this, I'm thinking about 5 years ago, and it was in response to the recession. And people were, and by the way, I think the recession isn't quite over yet in some respects, but the job market is much, much better than it was 5 years ago. So much better. And so if you are out there looking, you should be optimistic because there are opportunities. They're different. It's not the same world that it was, and I've seen the job market go through some incredible ups and downs, and usually what happened after the previous recessions, or well, they probably weren't recessions, but the previous dips, was things went back to normal. They went back to what they were before. That's probably not going to happen. There's been a complete reconfiguration. The way that firms and companies approach hiring is fundamentally different, and I don't expect it ever to return to what it was when I started practicing, or even what it was 10 years ago. But that's not a bad thing, because I've seen through some of these ups and downs, I've seen people land jobs that I think, that just doesn't sound right. That sounds kind of too good to be true when we're up on one of these upswings. Now the jobs that people are landing, they are real jobs. They're jobs that need to be done. And that's really encouraging for me. And the other thing is, when you look at unemployment rates, and they are relevant for attorneys, but not entirely. But even if you look at unemployment rates, that means that even if you look at 5% unemployment, even if we thought of 10% unemployment, which we've really never had, that means that 90 to 95% of all people who want a job have one. And that is also true for lawyers. So the odds are actually very, very good. But going through my checklist, the first thing that I want to do when I'm working with someone is help them figure out what they want to do. And I want to have them figure out not what they want to be. Often people, I say, well, what do you want to do? Well, I want to be a tax lawyer. That's not a do, that's a be. And that can be very misleading. And it can also get us into trouble, because when we say we want to be something, we're not able to articulate how we want to live each day, who it is we want to help, what kinds of problems we want to solve. So I'm very clear with my clients that I don't want you to explain it in terms of being. I want it to be in terms of doing. And I also want for people to have some concept of direction, but I like for them to have 3 alternatives, because we don't ever know whether the economy is going to support something at a particular time. There are certain practice areas. For example, now if you wanted to be a bankruptcy lawyer, this might not be the best time to go into that practice area. There are other aspects of it that you could probably explore, but and securities, for example, it's a practice area that goes up and down. Real estate goes up and down. And there are other, outside of the traditional practice of law, there are just things that are well received sometimes and not at others. And by 3 alternative choices, I'm thinking more in terms of a direction. And I like for people to have an idea of something they would like to do in a more traditional law practice setting. So maybe I'd like to do civil litigation, but then something that might be related to law, or I might like to be someone who does kind of helping people prepare for trial. There are consultants who help prepare for trial. And then maybe something where, if I hadn't gone to law school, what I would like to have done was X. And so we look at all 3 of those, create resumes for those, and then pursue them very strategically. And in considering those alternative areas or avenues to pursue, one of the exercises that I give to my clients is to look at their past accomplishments. And in doing that, I ask them to focus on what they do well, what they've done well, enjoyed while they were doing it, and were proud of when they had finished it. What I find with my clients is that the piece that's often missing is the enjoyed while they were doing it. And this is particularly true with litigators. They'll tell me about a case that they had, and they did it well. They got a great result for the client. They were proud of it when it was done. And I said, well, did you enjoy doing it? Oh, no. Actually, sometimes they'll say, I actually kind of got sick to my stomach when I was in the courtroom. I'm thinking, okay, that's not the way we want to live our life. We don't want to do something, because a lot of lawyers are very good at things they were never born to do. And sometimes I have the sense that we think that if it's not hard, it's not work, and we shouldn't be paid for it. I'm here to tell you that someday I'm going to give a CLE called Work is Not a Four-Letter Word, and I want for people to understand that if you can find something that's easy for you and that you don't think of as work, you're going to be happier, and your career will probably take off. I remember when I was still practicing, I felt as though I was an okay lawyer, and I got some good results, and I made partner. I mean, all of those objective criteria were there, but I also realized that I had classmates from law school who were being asked to give CLEs. They were rising in their careers, and I could tell that my career was kind of plateaued. And as I was contemplating becoming a career counselor for lawyers, I thought, it's not as prestigious as being a partner in a law firm. I thought, what if I go to a cocktail party and someone asks me what I do, and I would have to say I was a consultant. I thought that was going to be somehow it was going to be embarrassing. It was something that held me back, actually, from leaving the practice of law. And I realized how ill-advised that was to be living in that kind of bubble of, I wanted to be able to tell people I practice law. And so once I found something that was actually what I was born to do, that was when I started being asked to do CLEs. I had clients who were calling me. I didn't have to do all. I still did some marketing and everything, but that's the kind of career that you want to find. So I don't often want to. In fact, I don't like to even call myself someone who helps lawyers find jobs, because I want to help them explore their careers. Number 2 in my checklist is, are your finances in order? This one is very important, and what I often hear from my clients when I bring this question up is, oh, I just don't want to even think about it. I just can't even bring myself to face this. I know it's bad. I say, well, how much do you owe in student loans? Oh, I don't know. Well, how much do you pay every month? Oh, I think it's about such and such. And it's very important when you are engaged in a career search to have that piece of your life, to know what the status of it is, to look at it in a way that you can look at bringing expenses down, and that you contemplate, if you have student loans, how you will repay them. One thing that often happens is when you're in a career search mode, I know that people are tempted to take a deferment, and there are times when we have to, times when we simply can't make those minimum monthly payments and we have to take a deferment, but you want to be very careful in doing that. I had a client a number of years ago, one of my very early clients, and I think at the time that she came to me, she owed about $30,000 or $35,000, and over the years, she would land a job, but that wasn't quite right, and she would get a deferment, and then, anyway, the last time that I talked to her, she owed $120,000 in student loans. Because if you don't pay down the principal, even if you're paying your interest that has accrued in the past, that's what they'll take it against, your interest keeps building on that principal. And so you can have a much bigger number in later years. So it's something to pay attention to. On the positive side, though, I have a client with whom I worked just a few years ago, and she was able to take advantage of the loan forgiveness program. Her loans were federal loans, and as a result, she was able to land a job that paid pretty well at I believe it's the University of Washington Medical School, and she's working in administration. And it's considered the public service for the loan repayment plan, the loan forgiveness plan for federal loans, and she has a good salary. So and she does have to stay in a public service position for 10 years, and then all of her student loans will be forgiven. It's not one that fits everybody's needs, but it certainly is one that you'd want to explore if you have high student loans. And I would also recommend finaid.org as a website to just kind of get familiar with. And if student loans are an issue, I would also urge you to make an appointment to talk to the financial aid office at your law school. The third point on the checklist, and this is one I could probably talk for an hour. I could probably do a whole day-long seminar on networking. But I don't want to call it networking. I want to call it making friends and looking for clues. If you aren't making new friends in your job search or your career search, you're not really looking. oftentimes I'll get a call from someone and they'll say, well, I've been looking for a year and I just haven't found anything. And I say, well, what are you looking for? Oh, I'm just looking for anything. This, which brings us back, I'll just make this point under my checklist for number one. If we don't know what we're looking for, people can't help us. And probably the best example or worst example of someone who was looking and not realizing how unsuccessful it would be, this was probably 4 or 5 years ago. The Seattle Times did an article on how hard the job market was, and they featured someone who had bought an ad for the back of a bus. And he had his photo and his telephone number and said, looking for work. And the article was about how he'd run this ad for a couple months, no one had called him. And I thought, of course not. Why would they call him? Because I don't know if he wants to wash my floors or design my website or wants to write a program, or there's no way of knowing what he wants to do. So before you make new friends and go out there and network, you do need to be able to articulate what it is you want to do. And one of the ways I think that's best to be able to frame it best is to say, I want to help, and who you want to help and what you want to help them do. And for me, 21 years ago when I was starting my business, the breakthrough for me was when I could tell people, I want to work with lawyers who are going through transition. And I want to help them find what they want to do, and I want to help them figure out what they want to do, and I want to help them find it. So the pieces in that were, they now knew who to refer me to. They knew what it is I was looking for. And so you want to spend some time thinking about how you will explain yourself to your new friends and to the people you meet just in your ordinary, just in your everyday activities. What I recommend to my clients, if the job search or the career search is the focus of their lives, is that they reach out to about 5 new friends a day, either through telephone calls or emails or texts or however you initiate the contact, or LinkedIn. And you want to be asking them for information, advice, and referrals. But another way of looking at this is it's a treasure hunt. And what you're looking for, if you can imagine it, you're looking for where your talents meet the world's needs. So it's that intersection, and you're looking for that, and you're going out into the world asking for clues. So when you meet with someone, you don't ask them for a job, you ask them for clues. And you do this by getting information from them about what they do. You ask them for advice. You tell them, I'm looking at doing this. I would tell people at that point I was telling people I'm looking to work with attorneys who are going through a transition. What advice can you give me, and who else should I talk to? How many of you have heard that you need to network? And yes, and it's such a worn-out cliche, and I know that you're probably tired of hearing it, but one of the things I often hear when I tell people, well, you are going to have to network, you're going to have to work on this, and they say, but I've already talked to everyone I know. And that's fine, but that's not networking. Networking is talking to the people you don't know, the people who know the people you know. And it's the people you don't know yet who can help you. You've probably read, if you read enough career literature, you've read about and heard about the hidden job market. And the hidden job market means those jobs that are not advertised. They're not on the internet, they're not in the newspaper, they're not on the WSBA website, they're hidden. Meaning, at this point, I can almost guarantee you there are several offices in Seattle and companies where people are meeting over lunch and saying, gosh, we really need someone who can help us out with this, and we're going to have to add this person, and then the conversation happens, and depending on how busy they are, often when firms really need somebody, they're too busy to even advertise, and they don't want to advertise because they're going to receive so many resumes, and they're going to get calls from people who are out of work saying, have you gotten my resume yet? And then, so there's it's interesting, and it's kind of counterintuitive, but in a time when we're still in a kind of a transitional market, it's not we're certainly not in a upswing in the market by any chance. The reluctance of employers to run an ad goes up. They do not want to have to run an ad because they're going to get too many responses, and then the calls and everything that comes with it. So what you need to do is you need to be out there talking to the people who know the people you know, who know the people you know those people. And that's how you reach. It's probably between 75 and 95% of all jobs that are not advertised. And the only way to find those is the hard work and fun work, I would say, of talking to the people you know. And if you can imagine yourself, I better stay here so that people can see me on the webcast. If this is you, and these are the people that you know, and these are the people they know. It's out about 6 or 7 layers. So it's the people who know the people who know the people you know, the people you know. It's out about 6 or 7 layers that you can get hired. You're not going to get hired by, and the chances of getting hired by someone you know are very slim. The chances of even getting hired by someone they know are not great. Every layer out that you go, you increase the chances of finding something. And I used to think, well, of course, it makes sense because it's a numbers game. If you just say you know 150 people, and you pick 3 or 4 of them to call and to talk to, and they introduce you to 3 or 4 people, and then those 3 or 4 people introduce you to their 3 or 4, and you build out. And by the time you get to the 6th or 7th layer, you've probably been exposed to 1,000 people. Now, that's magical in itself, but what I read and what resonated with me is it's not just the fact that you're meeting so many people and being exposed to so many people. It's the new ideas. It's the fact that if you're only talking to the people you know, they live in a certain world that's very similar. They see the world through the same eyes that you see. And you need to get out of that and into a world where, and this was so true for me because the thought of doing career counseling for lawyers didn't dawn on me until a friend of mine told me to talk to her friend who was a banker. And I remember thinking, why do you want me to talk to a banker? I want to work with lawyers. Well, the reason was that this banker had gone from being a banker to being essentially a career counselor for bankers who had left the profession, left the industry. And that was what dawned on me. It was like, it was a completely new way to see the world, of something that I could do that was very different than what I had done before. But if I was only talking to lawyers, they could never have given me that advice. The other thing that you want to keep in mind as you're making new friends, and I hear this a lot, is when I say, well, what is it that you're looking for? And people often respond by saying, well, I can't find X. I didn't ask you what you were buying, but it's an automatic response. If you've been out there for a while and you've been answering ads, which is, if you answer an ad, you can assume that your competition is going to be pretty stiff. And a lot of people answer ads thinking, oh, I could do that job. Well, that's not the question. The employer is going to look at the resumes and the applications, and it's probably somebody at a clerical level who goes through and has a checklist of, we're looking for someone with these many years of experience, we're looking for someone who has these qualities, these skills, and they go through with a checklist, and they put the resumes literally into yes, no, and maybe piles. And so just the fact that you say, I know I could do this if they gave me a chance, is probably not in itself going to put you into the yes pile. And the yes piles are those who are going to get a call or an email saying, we'd like to talk to you either over the phone or have you in to meet with people. And keeping the attitude of, I'm making new friends as opposed to I'm networking, and I'm looking for clues. I'm looking for my buried treasure. If you think about that as you're meeting with someone and you're asking them for information, again, about their profession, about what it is that they do, what do they enjoy about what they do, and then advice. And then for this magical, so you can get out 6 or 7 layers, who else should I talk to? And some people who are very successful at making new friends kind of have a little game that they play with themselves, I think, where they try to average 3 new referrals from each contact that they make. So if you meet with someone and have coffee and you get information from them, try to get 3 names on average. Oh, and just an aside, not everybody with whom you meet as a new friend will want to be your friend. In fact, if you meet with 5 people, I would say that out of that group, 1 will be very negative. And I've had clients call me in tears after a networking meeting. There was one, she'd been a 6th year, I think she was about a 6th year litigator, and she was in a networking kind of an informational interview setting. She presented her resume to the partner in this firm to ask for his advice. And he said, well, if you really want my advice, I think you should start over. She called me in tears. And so there are going to be some people out there who will actually, unfortunately, be kind of mean. 2 or 3 of the people you talk to will be okay, and they'll give you some helpful ideas, but nothing that you haven't read before. And 1 out of 5 will be very helpful. So don't get discouraged. If you met 4 people who weren't very helpful, your next one probably will be the one who will be able to help you. And I can't overemphasize this. I talk to people a lot who are unemployed, or at least they tell me that they're not working, and yet when I ask them, well, are you making these calls, or are you doing all of this? No, I don't have time. And I'm thinking, well, but what do you do every day if you don't have time to make the calls to find the job that you want? So sometime I'd also like to do a seminar, I guess, on what would my day look like if I was unemployed? How would I schedule myself to best approach it so I was actually being strategic about it? And I think what I would do is I would get up early and jog and keep myself physically fit, because this is a marathon. I would probably then make a cup of coffee and read the morning paper. And this is, I'm going to save that because I have another, it's in a number 6. And then I would probably go and hang out at the public library. And the reason I would do that is there are lots of resources there, and I would probably try to find a place where I could make some calls, and I would want to be able to meet with people. This is because I would hopefully, I would want to land something in downtown Seattle. Now, if I wanted to land something someplace else, I might put myself in a different location. But this way, I could get out, and I would set myself up so I could do research, and I could be there so that if somebody could meet me for coffee on short notice, I would be able to do that. And I would be keeping very careful records of all of the interesting kind of things that I had kind of encountered and ideas, and I'd have a running list of all of the people I knew who might be able to answer these questions so that I could start making these contacts, and I could say, I'm interested in such and such, can I meet you for coffee, and can I ask you some questions? And I would make sure, and this might be something that I would do from my home, but I would reach out, if it wasn't by email, if I was doing, or text, if I was actually calling, I might do this from home, but I would reach out to 5 new people. And how do I know these 5 new people? They would be a combination of asking people who else should I talk to, and through some research and joining, which are parts of the checklist below. Once you meet with someone and you've asked them for information, advice, and who else should I talk to, please thank them. Send them a thank you. I don't think you need to I used to tell people one of the first things you want to do when you're changing careers, you're looking for a job, get a box of Crane's note cards and send them out. I think it's fine to send an email, but you do want to express your appreciation. And if they offer, if it's one of those 5, if it's the 1 out of 5 that really looks like they want to help you, and they have told you, please, feel free to give me a call, every 4 to 6 weeks, you should ping them. You should reach out to them and tell them, I followed your advice, that was great, I met so-and-so, and they were very helpful, but let them know that you're still looking. Because if you don't, they assume that you've landed and haven't let them know. So every 4 to 6 weeks. Now, this is not for the people who made you cry. It's not for the people out there who were mean to you, or the people who were just, you don't need to do it to all of them, but those people who genuinely express an interest in you and seem to take you under their wing, you want to reach out to them every 4 to 6 weeks. Number 6 on my list, whoops, I am there. There we go. Are you keeping up with the local, national, and international news? Are you reading professional and business publications? And are you calling the people who are featured in these articles? Or have you written an article? The reason I recommend this is first of all, one of the things that happens in law school, I think it starts in law school anyway, at least it did for me, is I became very insular. The world became this little bubble within the law school. I didn't really know what was happening out in the real world, frankly, I think I didn't care. But what happens if you do that is you aren't as interesting or as interested as you need to be when you're engaged in conversation in a career search. And that makes it more challenging when you're having these informational meetings. And I think that that kind of insular approach carries on with, for some of us at least, into our careers. The other reason, very pragmatic, is that there are great ideas for work for lawyers in virtually every publication, whether it's local, state, national, international. In fact, I often believe that every article, other than maybe, I don't know, if it's something about animals walking, I mean, sometimes we get some kind of little, animal interest stories, I'll call them, rather than human interest stories. But most stories in a newspaper, most articles, they do denote work for two lawyers. And often it's criminal. You see somebody arrested, you see someone charged. You know that there's a prosecutor and a defense attorney who's going to be involved. If you see an article about a business that's either doing very well or doing very poorly, there are probably going to be attorneys on both sides of these issues, or attorneys working with the company to help boost it both internally and outside law firm. If there's a major issue that's kind of brewing out there, there's probably going to be litigation. If you think strategically about this as you're reading the articles, I think a lot of times people are tempted to go to the back of the newspaper and say, oh, so what job is there for me today? I would instead start with the front page and work your way through, just kind of as a mental exercise, to see what it is that you can find. And I have my own story about this. Is I moved to Seattle before law school, and my intention was, and it worked out, was to establish residency and then apply to law school and go to law school. But I arrived in Seattle without knowing anyone other than my father's cousin, who was kind enough to offer me a place to stay. And during probably the second day that I was here, and I didn't have a job when I came, but I was going to try and work as a legal assistant or a paralegal for that year and establish residency, I picked up the Seattle Times, or the PI. We had two newspapers back then. I picked up the newspaper, and on the front page there was an article about a personal injury lawyer who had just gotten the largest jury verdict in the state. And it was a very interesting article because it was someone who had been injured in a work accident rappelling from a cliff where they were doing some highway construction or something. And the first three lawyers, I think, had turned down the case because they would have to fight the workers' compensation aspect of it. But this lawyer was able to work through all of that. And somehow, and I'm not sure why I did this, but I called that office and asked them if they needed any help. They actually invited me in. I met with it was a very small firm. They invited me in. I talked to them, and they said, oh, and why don't you have a beer with us after work? And they said, well, we don't really have a job for you, but we do have a lot of work that's backed up. We were in trial for 3 weeks. We've got calls that need to be made. We need to gather together some medical records. We've just got a lot to do, but we can't really represent to you that it's a job. And I said, that's fine. So I did. I worked part-time for them. And what happened was that, and of course on the rest of the time I was looking for work in a different law firm setting. I was sending out my resume. And what happened was they became a local reference for me then. So now I had a very prominent attorney who was willing to, and he was local because I didn't have any local contacts. And he was willing to say to people, look, she's really good. She can do this. And I was able to land a job in a relatively short period of time. I still don't know why I made that call. I mean, it looks kind of gutsy now when I think back to it. But it was good. And I think part of it was I was here. I didn't know anybody. I didn't have anything to lose. You want to be strategic about those kinds of calls. But when you're reading the paper, if you notice that the articles that you are drawn to are all written by the same person, and the articles always have a byline, and it gives you credit to the reporter who wrote that article. If you realize that it's always or mostly the same reporter, now I haven't tried this, but calling that reporter and buying that reporter a cup of coffee and finding out, and again, this is one of your new friends, because who better to give you information about an industry or a kind of the business world or anything like that than someone who's out there reporting and researching it every single day. One example of that is I was a president of the German-American Chamber of Commerce, and we were bringing in Airbus and Boeing, and they were going to be talking, and what I realized was there is one reporter who reports on aviation. There's a designated reporter at the Seattle Times whose job it is to keep abreast of all issues related to aviation. So every industry has a designated reporter, and you can reach out to them. Now, whether they return your call or not, again, it's probably one out of five. Probably 1 out of 5. But again, it's an avenue that you can pursue, and if you're sitting home and wanting to work, this is a way to kind of stir things up. Number 7, have you joined one or more sections of the state and local bar associations and other professional organizations, and are you involved? And I'm not just talking about joining. Don't just become a member and get the publication, get the email, and then think you've taken care of it. An example of someone who did this very strategically, I was invited to speak to a group, this might be 15, 17 years ago. She was the chair of, and I don't remember if it was the WSBA or the KCBA section of corporate counsel. So these were the in-house lawyers. Well, she was not actually an in-house lawyer, but she wanted to be. And that particular section at the time was not thriving. There was a section and there were members, but no one had really taken it on and done much with it. So they weren't having regular meetings. They weren't active as a section. So she took it on. She was the chair. And the beauty of that is if you are the chair of a section or you're actively involved in something that requires that you know who the members are, you get a membership list, which you don't get otherwise. If you just join the corporate counsel section of the bar, you don't have access to a magical list of all in-house counsel. But if you are in a position where you're the chair, and I'm not talking about doing this in a mischievous way, I'm talking about taking it on. I mean, she was genuinely doing a great job of it. She was an in-house counsel herself, but she was willing to take this section. She called speakers. She organized luncheon meetings. And when it came time for her to look for a job, she was able to reach out to the people she had contact with in the context of that section, and she landed a very good job. And it wasn't something contrived. It was very genuine because she had an interest in it. She had done a good job. She had come to be recognized as a leader within the group with which she wanted to work. The other way that you can look at the bar as a very wonderful resource for your career search is to, once you know the avenues you want to pursue, and assuming that some of them are practicing law or related to the practice of law, find those sections that are of interest to you and find out when the upcoming CLEs are going to be. And as a CLE speaker in the past, I can tell you that when you get the call and you say, oh yes, I'd be happy to do that, there's a time of reckoning. No, today wasn't a problem because I didn't have to come up with new materials and have citations and everything. But in the past, when I've done it for CLE credit, that you have to have materials. And the day when you get that call, you realize, you think to yourself, now why is it exactly that I thought this was a good idea? And so there's a magical time in there where many speakers who are looking at that time frame, that window between the time they said yes and the time their materials are due, would welcome someone who came forward and said, would you like some help with writing your materials? I mean, you would probably do it. You'd have coffee with them, say, I'm really interested in your topic, and I'd just like to know if there's anything I could do to help, and if you'd like some help with writing your materials. Now, it doesn't work very well, I understand, and I've had clients report this to me. If the speaker is with a large firm, they're probably going to assign it to one of the associates. A smaller firm is not going to have those kind of resources. So if you came in and said, I'd be happy to help you with it, there would, again, it's probably the 1 out of 5 rule. Not everybody is going to be receptive to this. but there will be people who will be. And then you have your name, assuming they're not jerks about it, assuming they give you credit for what you've written, and then you can use this person as a reference. You have materials in the practice area or in the area that you want to be recognized in. It has all kinds of benefits. And you can do this with other organizations. I work quite frequently with employment lawyers who are looking to make the transition into human resources. And there is I think it's called the Society of Human Resource Managers or Management, SHRM. And oftentimes my clients, in the process of their career search, they join this organization, they become active, they become integrated in a new professional world. And that, too, can be very beneficial. So if you're looking to practice law in a traditional setting, the Bar Association WSBA sections would be a great place to look. Look at the CLEs that are coming up and see if you can help out. Then number 9, and also I should tell you, I should have told you this earlier, but if you have questions as I'm going through, please feel free to interrupt and ask me questions. And number 9 on the list is, have you volunteered to help an attorney or professional who engages in one of your target practice or career areas? And when I'm talking about volunteering, I'm not talking about devoting 40 hours of your week to doing something that's not related to your intended target area for work. I'm talking about maybe 5 hours a week, very strategic, something that gives, there are lots of reasons for doing this. One is it gets you out of the house doing something meaningful. You start to feel professional again. You get to dress up. You get to go out there in the so-called real world. That can be very helpful for people who are there's a cycle of our self-confidence and everything dwindles sometimes when we aren't fully engaged and employed. So the volunteering can help immensely in that. But it also can introduce you to new people and new ideas in your new area. And it gives you, if you've done a good job, it gives you references. It also gives you credibility. It's hard to go into something that you've never done before and have credibility. And I remember when I started this work 20 years ago, one of my first clients said to me something to the effect of, it felt like she was saying, so why is it that you think you're qualified to do this? Good question. But the answer was, I actually had been doing things. When I thought about it long enough, I had been on the hiring committees for the firms where I had worked. I was a mentor to the associates. I had written, and this in fact, I did forget about it until I was going through files and everything, preparing for a move. I had written an article when I was a law student for a national ABA publication on resume writing. And I had surveyed attorneys all over the country and put this together in an article that was a cover story on the law student division ABA publication. So all of that was there. It was genuine. So when I'm talking about the volunteering, I'm talking about something genuine, something where it allows you then to say, yes, I have done this before, and this is the context in which I've done it. I once remember meeting with a young woman, and she wanted to move from the prosecutor's office to the private practice and do civil litigation. And I asked her, well, one of the things you're going to need is a writing sample. And she said, well, we won't really have those in the prosecutor's office. We don't really write the same kind of motions, and it isn't the same kind of practice. And I suggested that she volunteer to work with an attorney to create one, and she was not happy to hear this. And I could tell from her body language that she didn't really want to have to write something. Well, she did land in a firm, but it didn't work out. And I could have probably, I don't want to tell people that I'm nervous for them, but I was very nervous for her because her body language when I suggested that she do this voluntarily was clear that she did not want to write. So this is kind of a test, too. It's a way of sampling something and seeing if it is what you want to do. Another example of that would be for me when I've worked as the interim director of career services at the UW Law School. And I did this in part because so many people told me, oh, Karen, you need to do this. There was an opening, and you would be perfect. And I thought to myself, and at one time I had actually applied for it, and they didn't actually interview me. This was before I had made my own transition. But I thought, well, I should at least try it. I should give it a try. It was not the job that I imagined. It was not meeting with people. It was a lot of forms, a lot of administrative work. It was not me at all. But I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't worked there for 10 to 15 hours a week during a time when I was preparing for a maternity leave. I wouldn't have known that. So volunteering for something can be enormously helpful in terms of your career search for your self-assessment, in terms of having contacts and ideas and references. But yes. I think it's probably illegal. I think I'm not an employment lawyer, but I think. Oh, I need to repeat your question. The question, yes, the question was, what is my idea on taking a job where a firm will bring you on full time and not pay you? That's not my idea of volunteering. I think you can volunteer for a nonprofit. I'm assuming the firm is running for a profit, and they probably do have a profit. They are a profit center. Volunteering for a nonprofit, and again, 40 hours a week I think is too much. Full-time is too much because you need to be still doing your search. If they haven't committed to you, I think that if they were going to pay you I think it's fine to do a sharing of the risk is how I look at it. If they are saying, we just don't know what quality of work, or they're saying we don't know if we need someone, what are their reasons for saying that they want to try you out? I guess, can you explain that to me? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So here's the situation that she's talking about is that she's read where there are some very prominent people, and I have no doubt that this is true, who rose through the ranks within a corporation by saying, well, I don't have any experience, but I'll go to this company. I will offer to work for them for 4 to 6 weeks, and then they were hired. And those make great stories. The problem, one of the things that I've seen is a lot of transition in just, I'm most familiar with law firms because that's where I spent my time before I did this. And I remember I was at Williams Kastner for a long time, and I got to know Mr. Williams, who's no longer with us. But he talked wistfully about the time when he was a law clerk at the firm before it had his name on it. And he wasn't paid, but he was mentored as a clerk. He was hired as a law clerk. The difference is, when you're reading those stories, they probably happened a while ago, and there really was a quid pro quo. The quid pro quo was, I'll do good work for you, and you will mentor me. And if that were the case, I think it could work. I'm just not so sure. I think what I would advise, instead of working for free, I'm not an employment lawyer, but I think for a for-profit company or firm to bring someone in and not pay them something. But to say I'm still engaged in my career search, but I really respect the work that your firm does. I know that it enjoys a very wonderful reputation. I'd like to have the experience of working with you, and in exchange for mentoring, and even if it's a low hourly amount, it can be a very, very low amount. I mean, it could be even $15 or $20. But you would want to make sure that they understood that you were expecting that part of the compensation was mentoring. Then I think there's a way of making that work, but I wouldn't do it for 40 hours a week. I would do it on a project basis, and one where they aren't expecting you to do something 24/7 and taking you out of the career search market when you still need to be looking. But I think there's a way of volunteering, and when I say volunteering, I think you still can volunteer for a for-profit company or firm, but there probably has to be some recognized compensation, either in the form of a low hourly rate or absolutely recognized mentoring or some quid pro quo for what you're giving up. But good question. The final point on my checklist, and I do encourage people to ask lots of questions either now or after I've finished with point 10, are you spending 5 to 8 hours a day or 10 to 15 a week if you're employed on your career search? I am often surprised at how little time people spend even when they're not working. I sometimes think that people consider it to be doing a career search when they check the WSBA website, they maybe check ladders, they maybe talk to a friend or two, and then it's, well, I guess I don't have anything else to do. You should have a strategy that engages you from the time you get up until at least mid-afternoon. And then you do want to have some breaks. You want to keep yourself healthy. You want to have some fun activities that aren't too expensive, all of that. But you should treat this as a very important job. Just as when my clients have an interview and they say, well, I'll just wing it. It's like, would you go into federal court and make an argument that you hadn't prepared for? It's like, why would you do that? So, and when you're doing your own career search, I also find it fascinating because I'll talk to someone who says, well, I'm really good at researching. And I'm thinking, well, apply it to your career search. This is your opportunity to do research. There's a lot of research here to do. So as lawyers, we are problem solvers. That's number one what we are. And I've often been curious, in a world where there are so many problems, we probably have never had more problems, and somehow lawyers are unemployed. There's just something wrong with that picture. Because if we are problem solvers and the world has that many problems, somehow we should be positioning ourselves to both understand what those problems are and figure out how we fit into the solution. Any questions? Yes.
So we have a few questions from the online audience. One of them is a question about whether what your thoughts are or your insights are about using a recruiter or a headhunter type service assistance for a job as a job search strategy, and also how one would go about effectively really job searching from out of state, like they're licensed in Washington, but they're from afar and they're trying to kind of do some networking from afar. How would one best go about that? If you have any thoughts about those
Yeah, so really
points.
a two-part question. One is about, should I be working with a recruiter? The second one is, I'm out of state, licensed in Washington, how do I get into Washington? I'll take the first one. Recruiters. It would be great if there was someone out there with whom you could call them up and say, I'm looking for X, and they could say, oh, I have a company here, go out and interview. Unfortunately, for most job seekers, a recruiter is not going to be able to help. And the reason is that recruiters are brought in by a company or a firm where they can't find the person that they're looking for. So a third-year litigator, the firm's probably not going to pay a recruiter. They usually get 25 to 30% of the starting salary. So they can find that person on their own. They don't need to pay that recruiter's fee. If they're looking for something that's quite nuanced, they're looking for someone with 10 years of IP licensing experience with a third-party pay, subspecialty or something that's really nuanced and not very common, they will bring in a recruiter. I do coordinate with a recruiter. I share information with a recruiter. I tell her sometimes these are some of the people I'm working with. I would say that 1 or 2% of the attorneys that I work with, and 1 to 2% of all attorneys, are probably going to be able to work effectively with a recruiter. It's something where, and also, I'm glad you asked this question, because a lot of people will tell me that they don't get calls back. They'll call a recruiter, they'll email a recruiter, and they're upset. They're they're furious. I've emailed this recruiter. She's supposed to have a good reputation, and she hasn't responded. Actually, she can't. They often get 50 unsolicited calls in an afternoon. They can get 50 unsolicited resumes in a day. If they actually returned all of the calls, they couldn't do the work that they're being hired to do, because their job is to work with a firm or a company that's looking for somebody, maybe a general counsel, somebody who's got lots of experience, or in a law firm, they're looking for someone who brings in a book of business. And now, I mean, they're looking for people who bring in $500,000 worth of work, and that's what they're paying a recruiter to find. So when you don't get a call back, there's no reflection on you. It's that this person is being hired to find the very hard to find attorney. So it would be nice, and I remember when I first started doing this work, what I was trying to find was a recruiter who could help my clients find something outside of the traditional practice of law. So if I had a client who was looking to make this move, it's like, well, I don't want to practice law, but I want to do human resources. Would there be somebody out there who could actually find them that job? And it doesn't exist, because nobody's going to pay a recruiter to find someone who hasn't done the work before. So it only works when you've been successful in your career and you've created this track record and you want to move into doing the same thing but for a different company or firm. The second part of the question was, what if I'm out of state and I want to move into Washington, back to Washington maybe, because the person is licensed here? And that one, there are several ways to approach it. And I guess it depends in part on finances. If you are truly committed to moving to the state of Washington and you have enough funds to actually be without work for maybe 9 months to a year, I would say move here and do your search from here, because you're going to be able to network. And if you have the confidence that your skill set is going to be needed, I would move into the state. I would do the work from here. If that's not your situation, then you have to do the networking from a distance. So I think one of the ways that I've recommended to people that they do it is they set up a time. They set up 3 days, for example, that they are going to be in Seattle. They book that on their calendar, and then they start doing the networking calls. They call people and say, I'm going to be in Seattle on August 31st. And I would like to set up a time to meet with you. And do you have time? And do it far enough in advance. You don't want to say, I'm going to be in Seattle next week, because nobody can fit you into the calendar. So give people enough time, set aside 3 days, and start doing the calling, the emailing, get your calendar full, and then come to Seattle and meet with these people. And you probably are going to have to do it more than once. You're going to have to do that repeatedly. But you make calls, you do all of the things that you can do from out of state, but then you're probably going to have to do some things in state and on the ground here as well. Yes, Heidi, another question?
Yeah. So this question is, how would you advise someone address sort of a gap in their employment, either due to having to take time off for family, raise a child for a few years, or attend to a family member that's needing your time assistance, whatever. So how would you approach, or best approach, re-entering and restarting a career after having had some time away from it for a while, wanting to re-enter?
The question has to do with re-entering the profession after having taken a break. And I do have clients who face this, people who've taken time off to raise a family, maybe they've had a family crisis, sometimes their own individual issues. And probably the best way is, you don't want to have a complete gap. You don't want to have a time when you just had nothing to do with the law. And there usually are ways of staying connected. You can stay abreast by taking some classes. You want to be able to say that you've at least kept on top of it, so that you don't have a 7-year gap where you don't even know what the court rules are anymore and you haven't paid attention to it. Because not only is that a problem in terms of just your own, the uphill battle that you're going to have, but I, as an employer, would wonder, well, if he or she was really interested in it, wouldn't they have wanted to have stayed involved in some way? So if you're still in that gap, I would look at ways that you can steal some time. And we all, even in our busiest times, of raising a family or just total craziness, there still is some time that we can give to some type of self-enrichment and education. And you want to make sure that you have something so that there's not, I never advise a real true gap. So you've got 5 years where you don't explain anything. I think you can describe it as, and sometimes people have done some contract work during that time or whatever it is, or that you've kept abreast of this particular practice area. That would be a way of doing it. And then you don't want to that's not the first thing you would say is, well, I haven't practiced law for 10 years. You would say, I'm a litigator, I am looking to make my next move, and then when it comes time to explaining this gap, then you fill it in. But you don't, one partner that I worked with when I used to argue cases in court, and I would do this, probably the equivalent of, well, I haven't practiced law for 10 years when I was talking about the case, and he said, no, don't lead with your chin. So the idea of presenting it as I was very successful in my practice, and now I'm looking to do this again, as opposed to highlighting the gap. I think sometimes people become so focused on the gap, they forget that they have this experience, and we want to work on that experience, we want to enhance that experience, we want to build on that experience, and we want to do something to at least, so that it's not just a true, just like you dropped off the end of the face, you dropped off the face of the earth, and now you're reemerging. It's more gradual than that, and that's the advice that I give to my clients.
I just had another question that came through. So what are your thoughts about working through a temp agency to get exposure and experience?
Temp agencies. Glad you asked that question too, because if you really can't do the networking, it might be a way to get hired, but here's the problem with it, is they probably are taking 50% of your hourly wage. So if the firm is paying 50, you're probably getting 25. And that continues for the time that you are with that firm. You can never, I don't know, you don't know what the contract is that the firm has entered into with this temp agency, so you don't know what the terms are. The other thing is that they generally have a clause in there that if you're hired for permanent work, then they have to pay 25% of your first year salary. So it has very little upside to the candidate, to the attorney, unless that attorney just really can't get out there and do some of the legwork to find that opportunity on your own. You're just so much better off financially if you can do it on your own. Yes.
I read an article about door knocking, where you should go to a firm in which that you're interested and kind of do some research on maybe one or two partners that you may have things in common with or be able to speak about, and then show up and ask to speak to them, and then wait around to talk to them, and do this every 2 to 3 weeks until someone either speaks with you or then follow up with them in order to get a job. Have you ever tried this, and does it actually work?
That's a very good question. I'm a little reluctant to say yes, but if you're game to try it, I'd ask you to try it and let me know what happens. I think there might be a more, I'm trying to think of a respectful way to do it. And a more respectful way might be to email the person and explain why you're interested. And it can be, for example, if you know about a case that they had that was very successful, and you can write to them and say, I've read the article about your case. I'm intrigued by it for these reasons. I know your reputation in the community, and I would like to have 10 or 15 minutes of your time to learn more about it. I don't think it's really hard to go to a firm. Again, it's one of those things where if it's done respectfully, I'm not saying not to try it, but I'm not sure what the reaction will be. I think if it's a small enough firm. Now, if you go to a big firm, they are probably not going to even talk to you. Go to a mid-sized firm, you're probably going to have the same reception. If you go to a smaller firm and they're very busy, they might just bring you in and have you in for a cup of coffee and say, here's a project. I mean, it could happen. I wouldn't spend more than probably 10% of my job search time doing that, but I'm always intrigued by new approaches, and I would caution you to be very respectful and not to ask right up front for a job, but more, I'd like to know more about the firm. I was wondering if someone could talk to me. And you would have to expect that they probably won't have time, but be very excited if they do. And if they do talk to you, be very grateful. But I always hate to say don't do it, but if you do, I'd like to hear what happens, and I would be very respectful. Yes? You've got...
Almost every job that, I look at, or opportunity I look at, every one of them state the qualification must be a graduate of an accredited law school, and I've heard this term thrown out hundreds of times. I've been practicing 10 years. I'm 54 years old. I'm a criminal defense attorney, but that's limited my income, etc., but nevertheless, I didn't go to law school. I'm a Rule 6 law school graduate, and I don't know this, but is there anything that is a hindrance from having not gone to... I'm a practicing lawyer, passed the bar, but I find some discriminatory responses based upon that lack of qualification.
It depends on who you're talking to, I'm sure, because the largest firms are probably not going to bring someone in. There are firms in town where they won't bring in anyone who isn't in the top 5% of their class. There are firms that will only bring in associates, new summer associates from a certain approved list of universities, of law schools. There are all kinds of artificial restrictions that companies and firms put on themselves, and there's one company, very large company in town, that won't hire anyone who isn't currently employed. There are just all of these quirky things out there. And the accredited law school piece, I think that there are going to be firms that want someone who's accredited, but if you're looking at some of the smaller firms where they're really looking not for the sterling resume, they're looking for someone who can get in there, roll up their sleeves, get the job done, you're going to probably find a receptive audience. You don't want to go into the firm if they state accredited law school. That's one of those things where if you're looking at ads, you're probably missing 90% of the opportunities, and for you, those are going to be even harder because they are going to have these artificial restraints and that doesn't mean you can't do the work. It's just that you're going to have to go in there and talk to somebody who sees the world through the same lens and shares your values.
Hi, I was wondering, I know that cold calls are probably inevitable, and I always spend 10 or 15 minutes before each cold call sort of thinking up a transcript or how I'm going to introduce myself or how we're going to move on to some of the substantive stuff in the call. I was wondering if you happen to have a transcript that you use, or maybe even 2 or 3 sentences to sort of start things off well and get into the substantive issues.
Okay, the question has to do with cold calls and how do I start a cold call. I would say never make a cold call, but this is how to warming it up. And the ways that you can warm it up are through your making new friends. So say there is someone you want to call. You want to reach out to all of your friends and say, does anybody know him? You can do this on LinkedIn, and that's a really benefit of LinkedIn, so that you aren't just saying, hi, you don't know me, but. So instead, there are some magic words, which are, so-and-so recommended that I talk to you. So if you possibly can, you warm it up that way. Another way to warm it up is if you Google this person's name and you find something interesting about them, and then you can send them an email and say, dear so-and-so, I was reading about such and such, and I was very interested, and I have a couple of questions about this. So you're warming it up. And then if you really do have to do, I would almost say don't do the cold call. Do the legwork and the hard work of researching that it takes so that it's not a cold call, because cold calls are very seldom well received. And the other thing is that I'm often asked, I guess, well, what harm can there be if I send my resume to someplace? This is a little bit off your question, but it's an important point, I think, to make, is that, so maybe there's an ad for a firm and you don't know anything about it, but it looks kind of interesting. I'll just send my resume. Well, what happens in a firm when they get resumes is they actually have a database of the people who have applied in the past and what the disposition was. And when I was on the hiring committee, and this was before we had all of the databases and everything that we have now, we would keep track. So if somebody had applied for the third time and we had rejected them twice before, they got an automatic no. So you don't want to waste an application without, so if there is a firm that you might be interested in, don't just send your resume cold. Try to find somebody there to warm it up. You also use networking even for advertised positions. In fact, very seldom do I see people get hired for advertised positions without having a connection to somebody in that firm, company, or agency. But I would definitely, before you make a cold call, I would try and figure out some clever way, not too clever, but a clever way to make it warmer. Any other questions? Thank you very much.